My name is David Wurst, and I'm a graduate student in adapted physical education at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. What you just saw was not an assortment of clips of any students in physical education classes. Those were examples of several different classes where students with disabilities were actively, meaningfully, and appropriately engaged. And those students were being taught in a variety of physical education placements, some adapted or specially designed to meet their unique individual needs. The purpose of this video is to provide an in-depth overview of physical education service delivery for students with disabilities. Due to the unique educational needs of some students, we will focus on adapted or specially designed physical education. The target audiences for this video include parents of students with disabilities, general and adapted physical education teachers, physical education teacher education professionals, special education teachers and administrators, and related service personnel who want to learn more about collaborating with adapted physical educators. This video could also be used as a resource for parents preparing for their child's IEP meetings and as professional development for in-service physical education and special education teachers. The video is divided into 4 chapters. Chapter 1 presents information about the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, or IDEA 2004, and how it applies to physical education. Chapter 2 discusses how physical education is a required part of the special education process. Chapter 3 presents various physical education placement and service delivery options. And finally, Chapter 4 clarifies common misconceptions related to physical education for students with disabilities. Physical education for students with disabilities can encompass a wide range of possible placements and specialized instruction, all according to the student's unique needs. To the greatest extent possible, students with disabilities should have access to the general physical education curriculum. So let's return to some of the clips we saw in the beginning of our video and see what types of service deliveries were being implemented for students with disabilities. This scene shows a student with significant learning needs receiving specially designed physical education in a one-on-one setting. This scene shows students with various disabilities in their small or large group adapted physical education classes who may not yet be able to safely or successfully participate in a general physical education class. And this scene shows a general or inclusive physical education class where students with and without special education needs are actively and meaningfully participating in and benefiting from instruction. All of these examples represent different physical education placements discussed in this video. According to a 2010 report from the United States Government Accountability Office, or the GAO, results indicated that teachers need more resources in order to improve their delivery of services to students with disabilities. Throughout this video, I will discuss IDEA, physical education and how it is a part of the special education process for students with disabilities, and various physical education placements and service delivery methods for students with disabilities. First, let's begin with IDEA and see how physical education is a part of special education and defined under federal law. According to Section 339 of IDEA, special education means specially designed instruction at no cost to the parents to meet the unique needs of a child with a disability, including instruction conducted in the classroom, in the home, in hospitals and institutions, and in other settings, and instruction in physical education. This physical education requirement is sometimes an overlooked aspect of special education services. At times, it is confused with related services, such as physical or occupational therapy, but that will be mentioned later on. Within Section 339, physical education is defined as the development of physical and motor fitness, fundamental motor skills and patterns, skills in aquatics, dance, individual and group games and sports, which includes intramural and lifetime sports, and includes special physical education, adapted physical education, movement education, and motor development. In addition, Section 300 and 108 of IDEA contains specific wording to indicate that physical education services, specially designed if necessary, must be made available to every child with a disability receiving a free, appropriate public education, unless the public agency enrolls children without disabilities and does not provide physical education to children without disabilities in the same grades. There are key considerations that need to be explained here before we explore additional aspects of physical education mentioned in IDEA. Although the law states that physical education services do not have to be provided to children with disabilities if their peers without disabilities in the same grade are not being provided with physical education services, there is information that provides a very important second consideration about these services. Specific information is contained in the discussion section of the IDEA Rules and Regulations on page 46583 that states, second, if physical education is specially designed to meet the unique needs of a child with a disability and is set out in that child's IEP, those services must be provided whether or not they are provided to other children in the agency. Section 300 and 108 of IDEA expands on physical education requirements. According to the regulations, regular physical education means that each child with a disability must be afforded the opportunity to participate in the regular physical education program available to non-disabled children unless the child is enrolled full-time in a separate facility or the child needs specially designed physical education as prescribed in the child's IEP. Special physical education means that if specially designed physical education is prescribed in a child's IEP, the public agency responsible for the education of that child must provide the services directly or make arrangements for those services to be provided through other public or private programs. The final section on education in separate facilities states that the public agency responsible for the education of a child with a disability who is enrolled in a separate facility must ensure that the child receives appropriate physical education services in compliance with this section. It is very clear that physical education is a required aspect of special education. Students with disabilities are entitled to adapted or specially designed physical education according to the rules and regulations for IDEA. Since physical education is a direct service, it should be listed on a student's individualized education program or IEP as a special education service, and specifics such as the frequency and duration of these physical education services should also be listed. In addition to physical education content, in the IDEA Rules and Regulations, there are some important clarifications that have been published by the Office of Special Education Programs, or OSEP, within the United States Department of Education. These help clarify issues or questions presented by schools, parents, and others. These clarifications are issued by the department in the form of letters to the public and are available on their website. Over the past few years, three common areas of physical education misinterpretations have been clarified by these important policy letters: preschool-age children, secondary-age transition students, and substituting other subject areas for required physical education. There is often confusion about the requirement of adapted physical education services for preschool children ages 3 to 5, since most general education preschools do not offer physical education. OSEP addressed a situation where a school was not providing the child with specially designed physical education services as requested by the parents. The school misinterpreted that since other students their age were not receiving physical education services, no specially designed physical education services were required as requested by the parents. OSEP clarified that if physical education is specially designed to meet the unique needs of a child with a disability and is set out in that child's IEP, those services must be provided whether or not they are provided to other children in the agency. This is exactly what the second consideration means that was previously discussed. Another often questioned topic is physical education during high school transition ages of 16 to 21. An OSEP letter clarified the issue to establish that if a child has specially designed physical education prescribed within their IEP, the school must provide the child with those services. The rationale here is the same as that used for providing adapted physical education for preschool-aged children. A related confusion has to do with placement and the services provided within the placement. For example, students with IEPs aged 18 to 21 were placed in a community-based transition program. The United States Department of Education holds the position that the placement refers to the provision of special education and related services rather than a specific place, such as a classroom or a specific school. This means that regardless of the placement, if the child has physical education on his or her IEP, they should receive those services, regardless of whether their non-disabled peers receive the services. This reinforces the principle that special education is not a grade or age level service. A third OSEP letter clarifies that physical education cannot be substituted for or replaced by another subject. In the scenario addressed, the IEP team wanted to substitute a child's physical education requirement with additional reading. This substitution, however, is not supported under IDEA. Physical education instruction is required and must be provided for a child if prescribed on his or her IEP by the public agency responsible for providing the service in order for the child to meet the special education requirement. The OSEP letter stated that it would be inappropriate for the IEP team to deny children with disabilities the opportunity to participate in state-mandated physical education instruction for the sole purpose of providing them with additional reading instruction. This helps solidify the importance of providing required physical education to special education students. As seen in the IDEA regulations and OSEP letters of clarification, physical education is a required service in special education for students ages 3 to 21. Therefore, specially designed physical education services should follow the same process as all other individualized special education services. It is important to understand that there is a process that must be followed in order to determine eligibility for specially designed or adapted physical education, similar to any other special education or related services. In the next section, we'll review the special education process and show how specially designed or adapted physical education is a part of the same process. The process for determining if students with disabilities are eligible for adapted physical education services mirrors the steps used to determine the eligibility of students with disabilities for other special education services or related services. Let's illustrate these similarities and give some examples. The initial step of the special education process is to identify if a child meets the eligibility requirements of a special education disability category and has a need for special education and related services. Schools use a process called Child Find to identify children that may have a disability and qualify for special education and related services. Children suspected of having a disability are referred for comprehensive assessment and evaluation. Anyone with knowledge of the child's educational needs can make this referral, including parents and teachers. Parents must give consent for the evaluation or evaluations to occur. The next step is evaluating or assessing the student. The student should be evaluated within all areas related to the suspected disability. For classroom subject areas, evaluations may include reading, math, and literacy comprehension assessments to determine if there is a need for specially designed instruction. In physical education, teachers assess students in content areas such as physical and motor fitness, fundamental gross motor skills and patterns, and skills within various curricular content areas. Physical education teachers may also evaluate student behaviors to see how they impact their educational performance. Some common standardized assessments used by adapted physical education teachers include the Test of Gross Motor Development, the Peabody Developmental Motor Scales, Bruning's Ozoretsky Test of Motor Proficiency, and the Brockport Physical Fitness Test. These assessments must be administered and interpreted by qualified professionals such as an adapted physical education teacher. The evaluation results are analyzed by a team of professionals and shared with the parents to determine eligibility and need for special education and related services. The evaluation steps of the special education process incorporate a qualified group of professionals and parents who decide whether or not the child is considered a child with a disability. It is important to note that adapted physical education teachers are assessing to determine the need for specially designed or adapted physical education services. The next step involves a team of professionals, including the adapted physical education teacher, who determine the child's eligibility for a special education disability category. This is required in order to develop the Individualized Education Program, or IEP. A child is eligible if he or she meets criteria for a disability and demonstrates a need for special education. These professionals and parents are the IEP team. Once a child has been declared eligible for special education or related services, the IEP team meets to create the child's IEP. This team must include parents. The next step is scheduling the IEP meeting. It is important to note that the IEP cannot be created prior to the actual IEP meeting. The IEP team is responsible for aligning the contents of the IEP with the child's unique needs. Members of the IEP team include parents, regular and special education teachers, and the child if appropriate. The team will also include individuals with the capabilities to do the following: interpret evaluation results for their assessments, and represent the school administration. An adapted physical education specialist is often the person who will interpret assessment results in the physical education area. After the child has been found eligible for special education, the IEP can be developed at the IEP meeting. An IEP describes the educational program designed to meet the child's unique educational needs. This includes the student's present level of performance statements and goals for subject areas, including physical education, special education services, and, if appropriate, related services. If the student qualifies for specially designed physical education, there should be specific present level of performance statements and goals and objectives addressing the child's needs. It is important to note that if parents disagree with the recommended IEP, steps to mediate the program may be taken by the parents or the school to reach a consensus. Once the IEP has been developed and consented to by the parents, it is implemented. Parents are given a copy of the IEP, and the IEP team members have access to the IEP so they are aware of their specific responsibilities. These responsibilities include the accommodations, modifications, and supports needed for the child to succeed. The child will receive their specially designed instruction and the appropriate educational placement. Progress toward IEP goals must be reported to the parents on a regular schedule, like in general education. A child's progress can be monitored in a variety of ways. For example, adapted physical education teachers may be tracking a child's performance using a school-wide progress system to periodically record how a child is making progress towards their annual IEP goals and objectives. Another example would be when the adapted physical education teacher uses technology, such as an iPad, to record a student's progress to share with the parents or other members of the IEP team. At least annually, the IEP must be formally reviewed by the team. A meeting is held to discuss possible changes in a child's performance across all areas on the IEP. At the meeting, school staff will present progress reports and future recommendations. This is also an opportunity for parents to ask questions and make suggestions or requests about what direction they would like their child's program to go and what they wish to be included in the future. This can be in relation to the child's goals, educational placement, or method of service delivery. For example, if a parent requests a specific skill they wish their child to improve upon, such as swimming or riding a bike, the adapted physical education teacher can work with the parent's requests and align them with appropriate IEP goals and objectives to ensure their services meets these needs. Once every 3 years, students must be reevaluated to determine if the child continues to be a child with a disability according to IDEA, and if there is still a continuing need for special education and related services. If a child has a very unique situation where evaluation must take place more often, or the parents request to have the child reevaluated sooner, then the proper actions must take place. This is an important step for adapted physical education teachers in terms of a student's annual progress. If the child has progressed enough to where he or she does not require special education or related services for classroom subject areas, physical education services can still be provided if their physical education progress has not improved. Since it is possible that physical education services can be the only special education service a child receives, It is important that the adapted physical education teacher document all progress throughout the 3-year period to properly suggest recommendations for the child's future adapted physical education services. This multi-step process ensures that children with disabilities receive appropriate special education and related services. While most teachers and parents only consider this process to pertain to classroom subjects, general and adapted physical education teachers follow the same process as their general and special education classroom colleagues. Without following the proper special education process, students with disabilities may not receive the services they are guaranteed. In our next section, we'll discuss what a continuum of educational placements is, how these placements are used in physical education, and how general and adapted physical education teachers play a key role in deciding the most appropriate placement for students with disabilities to receive meaningful and beneficial instruction. The majority of students with disabilities are included in general physical education and instructed by their general physical education teachers. However, there are instances where a student with a disability cannot safely and successfully participate in the general physical education placement, even with supplementary aids and services. This means that a general physical education setting may not be considered the student's least restrictive environment. So what does a school do when they are presented with this situation? They look to an adapted physical education specialist in order to properly recommend the most appropriate placement or a combination of placements to meet the student's unique and individual education needs. The least restrictive environment is defined within IDEA in order to assist public agencies on appropriately placing students with disabilities. According to IDEA, to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities are educated with children who are non-disabled. This provides all students with access to the general education curriculum and standards. If it has been determined that a student with a disability cannot safely and successfully participate in the general physical education setting, adapted or specially designed physical education services should be written in the student's IEP. It is very important to understand that adapted physical education is the service for the child and not the placement. Let's take a look at the options along this continuum of physical education services for students with disabilities. The general physical education placement is desirable for each student since it allows students with disabilities to be educated with their peers without disabilities. In this setting, no extensive form of differentiation or adaptation is needed to help a student with a disability succeed with their peers without disabilities. If specific modifications or adaptations are required for a child to succeed, they should be outlined within a child's IEP. The accommodations could be implemented by the general physical education teacher or a paraprofessional assigned to the student. It is also common for general physical education teachers to consult with adapted physical education teachers about the necessary adaptations or accommodations prior to classes in order to learn how to implement them correctly. When the severity of the disability significantly impacts the child's or the peer's safety and success, the general and adapted physical education teacher may begin to reevaluate the most appropriate physical education placement. A change of placement decision can be based on what assistance the teacher and/or student needs for a successful experience, the sensory needs of the child, or the safety and success of the child and his or her peers. If it is still believed that the child could succeed in general physical education classes, then the student will continue to be placed in this setting, but receive additional support from the adapted physical education teacher. Another way to think of this placement is to imagine the adapted physical education teacher as a co-teacher for the class and focusing on the student who needs more individualized instruction. The adapted physical education teacher attends each of the child's classes and provides the necessary modifications for the student to be successful. This can include equipment adaptations, behavior management strategies, or developmentally appropriate instructions. There are instances where, even with the additional support from the adapted physical education teacher or paraprofessional, that the child's development is not progressing at an appropriate pace. When this happens, the child may need adapted or specially designed physical education services in addition to their general physical education class services. This dual placement incorporates more opportunities to develop skills and appropriate behaviors in order to make more progress towards participating with their peers without disabilities. Within this separate placement, the adapted physical education teacher will pull out the student from a general education class and take them to their desired location to provide them with services. Adapted or specially designed physical education can take place in a variety of areas within the school, including a gymnasium, a multipurpose room, classroom, or a hallway. Instruction in these placements can be provided in a one-on-one session with the student or within a small group with other students with disabilities. Sometimes students will receive these services once a week, while other times it may be 3 times a week, in addition to their general physical education class. The specific frequency and duration of these services should be documented in detail on the IEP. The next placement option within this continuum is often referred to as an adapted physical education placement. As mentioned before, adapted physical education is the service, not the placement. If the student cannot safely or successfully participate in general physical education class, even with supplementary aids and services, but has been prescribed specially designed physical education within their IEP, then they will receive adapted physical education services in a separate setting within the school. This can be compared to classroom instruction, where a specialist in reading or math will instruct students within a small group outside of the general classroom. Similar to the previous placement, this may take place in small or large group adapted physical education classes, in a one-on-one instructional placement with the adapted physical education teacher, or a combination of the 2 placements. A final example for a placement option relates to a child who may be prescribed to receive specially designed physical education services in an adapted physical education placement located outside of the school building that would generally be appropriate for the student. This placement is not decided based on the availability of space within the child's school building or the availability of personnel or resources. This placement is chosen based on the significant impact the disability has on the child's performance within a typical public school. The instruction that takes place within this placement is similar to that of the adapted physical education placement in school. An example of this would be a student with a significant behavioral issue who may be placed in an alternative education program outside of the typical public school building. The placements discussed here are typically the most common types of placement options seen within public schools today. Placement options should be discussed during the child's IEP meeting so that the appropriate accommodations can be made for the child to receive physical education services that are meaningful, beneficial, and in the least restrictive environment. Some school districts may offer different physical education placements based on the staffing and other factors. The continuum of placements discussed can provide general and adapted physical education teachers with placement options for students with disabilities in physical education. Even with this information, the delivery of physical education services are often misinterpreted and inappropriately provided. Let's conclude the video by discussing a few common misconceptions to clarify appropriate practices in physical education service delivery for students with disabilities. Even with the inclusion of physical education in IDEA, available resources, and professional development opportunities, several misconceptions exist about physical education for students with disabilities. The following are a few examples with information to help dispel these myths. Misconception number 1. Students with disabilities are automatically eligible for adapted or specially designed physical education services and should be placed in separate adapted physical education classes. As discussed in the section regarding the special education process, students with disabilities who may benefit from specially designed physical education services must go through the special education process in order to be considered eligible for adapted physical education services. The American Association for Physical Activity and Recreation published a very useful position statement that discusses eligibility criteria for adapted physical education services. A few highlights from this document include considering students to be eligible for adapted physical education services if their comprehensive score is 1.5 standard deviations below the mean on a norm reference test, or at least 2 years below age level on a criterion reference test or other test of physical and motor fitness. In fact, there are many students with disabilities who are very appropriate for general physical education, For example, many students with specific learning disabilities or mild physical disabilities can easily participate with their peers without disabilities with the use of reasonable accommodations and adaptations. Misconception number 2. All physical education teachers have the skills, knowledge, and dispositions to teach students with disabilities. According to a position statement published by the American Association for Physical Activity and Recreation, adapted physical education specialists must meet additional requirements in order to be considered an appropriately prepared physical education teacher capable of providing individualized instruction to students with disabilities. These requirements include having a bachelor's degree in physical education teaching education, achieving 12 semester hours of coursework that specifically addresses the educational needs of students with disabilities, which includes 9 hours specifically for adapted physical education, having experienced at least 150 hours of practicum experience teaching students with disabilities, and attending professional preparation programs that are based on standards for adapted physical education. The expertise of adapted physical educators includes their abilities to evaluate students for special education eligibility, select the least restrictive educational placement for the student to receive their services, and to provide individualized instruction for children with disabilities based on their unique needs. Many states have separate add-on teaching licenses in adapted physical education. Misconception number 3. A student with a disability has either full-time general physical education or separate adapted physical education. We discussed the continuum of placements used for students to receive specially designed physical education. On that continuum, one placement option referred to a dual placement, which included instruction both in the general physical education classroom as well as an adapted physical education placement setting. Therefore, if prescribed on the IEP, a student with a disability can receive part of their physical education services within the general physical education class, and instruction within a designated adapted physical education setting. The most important point is that appropriate options should be available to best meet the needs of individual students. Misconception number 4. Physical education and physical therapy are interchangeable, or physical therapy can be substituted for physical education services. Under IDEA, physical education is required and part of the definition of special education. Physical and occupational therapy are defined as related services. Related services, as defined under Section 334 of the Federal Register, means transportation and such developmental, corrective, and other supportive services as required to assist a child with a disability to benefit from special education. Related services include speech-language pathology and audiology services, interpreting services, psychological services, and physical and occupational therapies. Because these related services are designed to assist a child with a disability to benefit from special education, which includes physical education, related services cannot be substituted for physical education. Rather, physical education and related services personnel should collaborate as a motor team to meet the needs of specific students. Misconception number 5. Adapted physical education teachers are not involved in the IEP process. IDEA states that the IEP team should be composed of persons with knowledge of the child's educational needs. This means that if a child has been evaluated to receive specially designed or adapted physical education and has been prescribed within their IEP, the IEP team must include a general physical education and/or an adapted physical education teacher to make appropriate decisions for the child's program. In this video, we have seen that physical education is an integral part of special education law, how a child is evaluated for special education services, where the child can receive the specially designed physical education services throughout a continuum of settings, and common misconceptions about general and adapted physical education services. Physical education is included in the definition of special education and is a required special education direct service for students with disabilities. The special education process used for identifying, evaluating, and placing students with disabilities is also used in physical education. Through this process, students with disabilities are placed and instructed within a continuum of placements directly related to physical education. Implementing the content within this video will help dispel misconceptions about physical education services for students with disabilities. I hope the video provided an informative view of physical education service delivery for students with disabilities. Thank you for watching.